The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Matthews' front porch as he settled into his favorite wooden rocking chair, the same one he'd been sitting in for the past 30 years. At 93, his movements were slower than they used to be, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he served in World War II. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, carefully wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee, a habit he'd maintained since his Navy days. Harold's small suburban home on Maple Street stood out from the others, not because it was fancy, but because of how well he maintained it. The white paint never peeled, the grass was always cut to exactly 2 inches, and his garden bloomed with colors that made passing cars slow down for a better look. Every morning, like clockwork, he followed the same routine he'd kept since retiring from the post office 28 years ago. Living alone since his beloved wife Martha passed away 5 years ago, Harold found comfort in the predictability of his days. He would wake up at 5:30 a.m., just as he had done in the service, make his bed with hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter off, and prepare his simple breakfast of toast, eggs, and that essential cup of coffee. The neighborhood kids called him Grandpa Harold, even though none of them were actually related to him. Mrs. Chen from next door often brought him homemade dumplings, worried that he wasn't eating enough. Harold always accepted them with a warm smile, remembering how his unit had been helped by Chinese villagers during the war. He never talked much about those days, but the memories lived in his eyes, especially when he looked at the old photographs hanging in his living room. His house wasn't large, but it held treasures that told the story of his life. The living room walls displayed his service medals in a simple wooden frame, and beside them hung pictures of his time aboard the U.S. Henderson in the Pacific. The most prominent photo showed a young, strong Harold in his Navy uniform, standing proudly with his shipmates. Below it sat Martha's favorite vase, always filled with fresh flowers from his garden. In the front yard, Harold's pride and joy spread out in neat rows and circles, his garden. He grew everything from practical vegetables to Martha's beloved roses, which he tended with special care. The red roses were her favorites, and he made sure they bloomed beautifully every spring, just as they had when she was alive. The neighborhood children would sometimes help him water the plants, and he'd teach them the names of each flower and vegetable, sharing simple gardening tips their parents would later thank him for. Throughout the day, Harold would work in his garden, take short walks to keep his legs strong, and watch the world go by from his porch. He knew every neighbor's schedule, when Mr. Thompson left for work at the bank, when the school bus picked up the Anderson kids, and when Mrs. Rodriguez returned from her nursing shift. He kept an eye out for everyone, making the streets safer just by being there. Some afternoons, he'd sit with his old radio, listening to baseball games and remembering how he used to play catch with his son James, who now lived in California with his own family. They called twice a week, and though Harold missed them, he understood that life moved in its own way. The photos of his grandchildren covered his refrigerator, their smiling faces reminding him of why he'd served his country all those years ago. As each day drew to a close, Harold would follow his evening routine, checking the locks twice, old habits die hard, watering his indoor plants, and settling into his armchair with a book about naval history or gardening. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock Martha had loved filled the quiet house, keeping him company as night fell. Life was simple but good, and Harold had found peace in his routines and quiet ways of helping others. He never expected anything to change. After all, at 93, he thought he'd seen everything life could throw at him. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising even the most prepared souls, and Harold Matthews' predictable world was about to face a challenge that would test everything he'd learned in his long, remarkable life. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in April. Harold was trimming his hedges when the sound of rumbling engines echoed down Maple Street. At first, he thought it might be Mr. Thompson's old truck acting up again, but the noise grew louder until 5 motorcycles roared past his house, their chrome pipes gleaming in the spring sunlight. They stopped at the empty lot next door, the one that used to be the Williams family home before the bank took it 2 years ago. Harold watched as the bikers, dressed in black leather jackets with patches he couldn't quite read, kicked down their stands and gathered in a circle. Their loud laughter carried across his yard, making him pause his gardening work. Mrs. Chen hurried her 7-year-old grandson Tommy inside when she saw them. Across the street, the Anderson kids stopped playing hopscotch and ran to their front door. Harold stood quietly, his hedge clippers still in hand, observing how quickly the peaceful atmosphere of their street had changed. The next day, more motorcycles appeared. This time, there were 12 of them, and they brought a beaten-up old van filled with coolers and folding chairs. They set up what looked like a temporary meeting spot, complete with a portable radio that blasted music Harold had never heard before. The bass was so strong it made his windows rattle. Little Tommy, who usually helped Harold water his roses every Thursday, stopped coming over. "Mom says I should stay inside when the scary men are there," he explained through the fence one morning. Harold's heart sank, seeing fear replace the joy that once filled their friendly street. The bikers seemed to notice Harold watching them. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, would rev his engine extra loud whenever passing Harold's house. Others began parking their bikes closer and closer to his property line, their tire tracks leaving ugly marks on the grass he carefully maintained for decades. One week turned into two, and the situation got worse. Empty beer cans sometimes rolled into Harold's yard, and the music played later into the night. Mrs. Rodriguez, who worked night shifts at the hospital, couldn't sleep during the day anymore. Mr. Thompson tried calling the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do as long as the bikers weren't breaking any specific laws. Harold noticed how the motorcycle club had taken over the rhythm of the neighborhood. Parents drove their children to the bus stop now, instead of letting them walk. The evening walks that elderly couples used to take stopped completely. Even the mail carrier, who had always stopped to chat with Harold, now rushed through his deliveries. The breaking point came during one particularly rowdy afternoon. Harold was inside, looking through his old photo albums when he heard engines revving closer than ever before. Looking out his window, he saw 3 motorcycles parked partially on his lawn, their back wheels crushing the edge of his flower bed. The riders were laughing, pointing at his "Keep Off the Grass" sign as if it was the funniest joke they ever heard. Harold watched as they knocked over his mailbox, accidentally, while backing up their bikes. The crash reminded him of distant explosions from long ago, but he pushed those memories aside. Instead of getting angry, he felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same feeling he used to get before important missions during the war. That evening, as Harold sat in his rocking chair watching the bikers laugh and drink in the lot, he began to form a plan. His military training had taught him that the best strategy wasn't always the most obvious one. As he studied the group, he noticed things others might miss, the way some of them sat, how they carried themselves, the faded military tattoos partially hidden under their newer ones. Looking at his reflection in the window, Harold saw not just a 93-year-old man, but a veteran who had faced bigger challenges than this. The solution wouldn't come from confrontation or calling the police again. No, he would need to use the wisdom that only comes from living through nearly a century of history. As darkness fell and the bikers' music echoed through the neighborhood, Harold Matthews smiled slightly. Tomorrow, he would start putting his plan into action, and it would be something none of them would expect. The next 2 weeks brought changes that made Harold's quiet street feel like a different world. The motorcycle club, which called themselves the Road Warriors, had grown bolder with each passing day. Their numbers had swelled to nearly 30 members, and the empty lot had become their unofficial headquarters, complete with a makeshift bar and even a few tents. Harold watched from his porch as 3 new motorcycles rolled in, their engines deliberately revving near his rose bushes. The leader of the group, whom the others called Big Mike, seemed to take special pleasure in disturbing the old veteran's peace. Every morning, just as Harold settled in for his coffee, Big Mike would circle the block 3 times, each pass louder than the last. The neighborhood had developed new habits born of fear. Mrs. Chen now did her grocery shopping at 7 a.m., rushing back before the bikers woke up. The Anderson children hadn't played in their front yard for weeks, and Mr. Thompson started parking his car 3 blocks away to avoid confrontations with motorcycles blocking his driveway. One particularly tense afternoon, Harold was watering his garden when he overheard 2 younger bikers talking. "Check out Grandpa General over there," one sneered, pointing at Harold's carefully pressed khaki pants and polished shoes. "Still playing soldier in his little garden." The other laughed, making mock saluting gestures when Harold looked their way. What they didn't notice was how Harold's grip on the garden hose tightened slightly, or how his eyes narrowed just a fraction, the same way they used to when he was plotting convoy routes through enemy waters. He continued watering his plants, but his mind was working, processing every detail about the group that might prove useful. The situation reached a new level when the bikers started having midnight parties. The music would blast until 2 a.m., and the roar of motorcycles coming and going made sleep impossible for everyone on the street. Mrs. Rodriguez, finally fed up after 3 sleepless days, marched over to complain. Harold watched anxiously from his window as the nurse's small figure confronted the wall of leather-clad men. Big Mike towered over Mrs. Rodriguez, his shadow completely covering her scrubs-clad form. "Listen, lady," his voice boomed across the lot. "Why don't you invest in some earplugs? We ain't breaking any laws here." The other bikers laughed, some revving their engines to drown out her protests. Harold noticed something interesting during this confrontation. While most bikers joined in the mockery, 3 of them stood back, looking uncomfortable. One even took off his helmet respectfully while Mrs. Rodriguez spoke. Harold filed this observation away, adding it to his growing mental notebook of details about the group. The next morning, Harold found tire tracks cutting through his front lawn, creating ugly brown scars in the green grass he'd maintained for decades. Near his mailbox lay scattered pieces of his American flag, which had been flying there since 1975. The pole was bent at an angle, the eagle at its top now facing the ground instead of the sky. Several neighbors came by to help and clean up, but Harold waved them off with a gentle smile. Sometimes, he told young Tommy, who had sneaked over despite his mother's warnings, you have to let things get worse before they can get better. The boy didn't understand, but Harold's calm demeanor gave him hope. That evening, as Harold sat in his living room looking at old photographs, his eyes fell on a particular image from 1945. It showed him and his shipmates celebrating after a successful mission, their differences forgotten in the face of a common goal. Next to it stood a more recent photo of him at a veterans' memorial service, surrounded by servicemen from different eras. Something clicked in his mind as he studied these images. Harold had spent years in the Navy learning to read situations, to find opportunities where others saw only obstacles. Now, watching through his window as the bikers gathered for another evening of disruption, he noticed more details: military tattoos, certain ways of standing, occasional phrases that only someone with service experience would use. Harold Matthews slowly stood up, his decision made. Tomorrow wouldn't be about confrontation or calling the police again. No, tomorrow he would launch a different kind of operation, one that would draw upon his decades of experience in ways the road warriors would never expect. As he went to bed that night, the sound of motorcycle engines didn't bother him as much. After all, they would soon become an important part of his plan. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Harold woke at 5:30 a.m., made his bed with military precision, and headed to the kitchen for his morning coffee. Through his window, he could see the empty lot where several bikers had spent the night in their tents, empty bottles scattered around their makeshift camp. As he stepped onto his front porch, the morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon. Harold's eyes immediately went to his beloved rose garden, and that's when he saw it. His heart nearly stopped. The special roses he had planted for Martha, the ones he had tended every day for the past 30 years, lay crushed beneath 2 motorcycles that had been carelessly parked during the night. These weren't just any roses. Martha had picked out these specific pink roses on their 40th wedding anniversary, just 2 years before she passed away. "They'll bloom every spring," she had said, "and you'll remember our mornings together." Harold had kept that promise, nurturing those roses through every season, through drought and storm. Now they lay broken, their delicate petals scattered across the tire-marked soil. One of the motorcycles had leaked oil into the flower bed, creating a dark stain that seemed to mock all his years of careful gardening. The wooden sign Martha had painted with "Love blooms here" was snapped in half under the wheel of the second bike. Mrs. Chen, who had been watching from her window, hurried over with a cup of tea and tears in her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Matthews," she said softly, "I saw them do it last night. They were so drunk. I wanted to call the police, but—" Her voice trailed off as she noticed Harold's expression. But Harold wasn't angry. Not exactly. Instead, a strange calm had settled over him, the kind of tranquility he remembered from his days in the service when facing a crucial mission. His hands, which should have been shaking with rage, were steady as he took the tea from Mrs. Chen. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same steady tone it had held during storms in the Pacific. "Would you happen to have any of those dumplings left? I believe I'll need them for something special." Confused but relieved by his calmness, Mrs. Chen hurried home to get the dumplings. Meanwhile, Harold went inside and walked straight to his study. He opened the bottom drawer of his old desk and pulled out a dusty photo album he hadn't looked at in years. It was marked Service Years, Pacific Theater, 1943 to 1945. As he flipped through the yellowed pages, his eyes focused on particular photographs, ones showing how his unit had turned enemies into allies through understanding and respect. There was the image of his captain sharing coffee with a former Japanese soldier who had helped them navigate treacherous waters. Another showed his crew teaching local islanders how to repair boat engines, building trust that later saved their lives. Harold heard motorcycles starting up outside. Through his window, he watched as the bikers who had crushed his roses slowly came to consciousness, nursing their hangovers. One of them, noticing the damaged roses, actually looked concerned for a moment before his friends called him away. That's when Harold saw it, the tattoo on the concerned biker's arm. It was partly covered by his leather jacket, but Harold recognized it immediately, the insignia of the modern infantry. The same symbol he'd seen on young soldiers during his visits to the VA hospital. Walking to his closet, Harold pulled out his old dress uniform. It still fit, though a bit snugly. He carefully pinned his medals to the chest, not all of them, just the ones that told the right story. Then he went to the kitchen and began pulling out ingredients he hadn't used since the last veterans' potluck 5 years ago. Mrs. Chen returned with the dumplings to find Harold making lists and checking his old address book. "Mr. Matthews?" she asked worriedly. "What are you going to do?" Harold smiled, the same smile that had reassured nervous young sailors during typhoons. "I'm going to do what the Navy taught me, Mrs. Chen," he said, reaching for his phone. "Sometimes, to win a battle, you have to surprise the enemy by not having one at all." His first call would be to the VA hospital. The second would be to his old friend who owned the local barbecue restaurant. The road warriors were about to learn that this 93-year-old veteran had strategies they never saw coming. Harold spent the next 3 days preparing for what he called Operation Understanding. His living room became a command center, just like the war rooms he remembered from his Navy days. On his coffee table lay a detailed plan written in his neat handwriting, along with newspaper clippings about local veteran support groups and motorcycle clubs. His first call to the VA hospital had revealed something interesting. Jake Thompson, one of the nurses there, was the younger brother of a Road Warrior member. Through Jake, Harold learned that nearly half of the bikers were veterans themselves. Iraq and Afghanistan mostly, with a few from Desert Storm. This information made Harold nod thoughtfully as he added it to his notes. The second part of his plan involved Tom Martinez, his old friend who owned the most popular barbecue restaurant in town. 40 years ago, Harold had helped Tom get his start by sharing his secret Navy barbecue recipe, the one that had made him famous among his shipmates in the Pacific. Now Tom was more than happy to return the favor. "You want me to cater for how many people?" Tom asked over the phone, his voice filled with surprise. 35 to be safe," Harold replied, his voice steady. "And Tom, remember that special sauce we made for the 1975 Veterans Day celebration? We'll need that too." While Harold worked on his plan, the bikers continued their usual routine in the empty lot. But now, instead of turning away, Harold watched them more carefully. He noticed how they arranged their bikes in formation, how they posted lookouts, how they used hand signals that looked very familiar to his military-trained eye. Mrs. Chen caught him measuring his front yard one morning. "Mr. Matthews, what are you doing?" she asked, worried that the stress had finally gotten to him. "Planning a battlefield, Mrs. Chen," he answered with a smile. "But this time, we're going to use tables instead of tanks." He showed her his diagram, where he had mapped out exactly where each table, chair, and cooking station would go. Just like planning a naval operation, every detail mattered. Harold's next step involved reaching out to his old veterans network. He called Jim Parker, who served in Vietnam and now ran the local veterans support group. "Jim, remember how we used to say that understanding comes through breaking bread together? Well, I need your help with something." Word spread quietly through the veterans community. Many were skeptical at first. After all, the Road Warriors had earned quite a reputation, but Harold's reputation carried more weight. If Harold Matthews, who had survived 3 major Pacific battles and saved his entire unit through quick thinking, said this was the right approach, who were they to argue? On the 4th day, Harold put on his dress uniform and walked straight into the bikers' camp. The morning chatter stopped as the elderly veteran approached. Big Mike stepped forward. probably expecting another complaint about the noise. Instead, Harold stretched out his hand. "Good morning," he said clearly. "I'm Harold Matthews, United States Navy, Pacific Theater, 1943 to 1945. I'd like to invite all of you to a barbecue at my place this Saturday." The bikers looked at each other in confusion. One of them laughed, but quickly stopped when he saw Big Mike's expression. The leader was staring at Harold's medals, particularly the one that marked him as a survivor of the Battle of Lake Gulf. "I see quite a few military tattoos among you gentlemen," Harold continued, his voice carrying the same authority it had held when he was a young officer. "Different wars, same brotherhood. My shipmates and I learned that sharing a meal can do more than sharing angry words." He handed Big Mike a formal invitation, printed on proper cardstock. 2 o'clock Saturday, full barbecue, my old Navy recipe. Veterans from several generations will be there. Would be an honor to have you all attend. Before anyone could respond, Harold turned and walked back to his house, his posture perfect despite his age. Behind him, he could hear the bikers murmuring among themselves. As he reached his porch, he heard Big Mike's deep voice. "Hey, old-timer, what if we say no?" Harold turned slightly. "Then you'll miss out on the best barbecue this side of the Pacific, and believe me, son, I tried them all." With that, he went inside, leaving the road warriors to make their decision. That evening, as Harold checked his lists one final time, he smiled at Martha's picture on the wall. "Different battle, same strategy, my dear," he whispered. "Sometimes the best way to win is to make your enemies into friends." Saturday arrived with perfect weather, almost as if nature itself approved of Harold's plan. By noon, his front yard had been transformed. 6 long tables covered in red and white checkered cloths formed a horseshoe shape, with the open end facing the empty lot. Tom Martinez's professional barbecue setup filled the air with mouth-watering smoke from Harold's secret recipe. Harold stood on his porch in his dress uniform, watching Jim Parker and other veterans from the support group set up photo displays on easels. The pictures showed military personnel from World War II through Afghanistan, carefully chosen to tell a story of shared service across generations. At 1:30, Mrs. Chen peeked over the fence. "Mr. Matthews, they're still there," she whispered, pointing to the bikers in the empty lot. The road warriors had been watching the setup all morning, their usual loud music noticeably absent. They sat on their bikes, talking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward Harold's yard. "They'll come," Harold said confidently, adjusting his medals. "The smell of good barbecue can break down any wall." As if to prove his point, the wind carried another wave of smoky aroma across the street. By 1:55, veterans from different eras had arrived. They stood in small groups, some in uniforms, others in civilian clothes with military caps or pins. Young Tommy watched from his window as more cars parked along the street than he'd seen since Christmas. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the sound of motorcycle engines filled the air. The road warriors, led by Big Mike, rolled up to Harold's house in formation. They parked their bikes in a neat line, demonstrating discipline that Harold had noticed during his observations. Every single member had come, and to everyone's surprise, they were all wearing their best leather vests, polished boots, and cleaned-up appearances. Big Mike approached Harold first, holding the invitation card. Up close, Harold could clearly see the Marine Corps tattoo on the biker's neck that he'd spotted earlier. "Permission to join the gathering, sir?" Big Mike asked formally, showing a military courtesy that surprised the watching neighbors. "Welcome home, Marine," Harold replied with equal formality, extending his hand. The handshake between the 93-year-old sailor and the burly biker seemed to break the tension. Other road warriors began moving forward, many of them unconsciously falling into a military-style line. As the bikers integrated with the other guests, Harold's strategy began to unfold. He had strategically placed photos and memorabilia that would spark conversations. Near the drinks table, a young road warrior stopped to stare at a picture of Harold's old destroyer. "My grandfather served on one just like that," he said to no one in particular. "U.S. Henderson," Harold replied, appearing beside him. "Pacific Theater. Would you like to hear about the time we outmaneuvered a typhoon?" Soon, a small crowd gathered, mixing leather vests with military uniforms as Harold shared his story. Tom Martinez worked his magic at the grill, serving up Harold's special recipe. "This sauce," one of the bikers exclaimed, It tastes just like what we had at this little place in Baghdad. An older veteran from Desert Storm joined the conversation, and soon they were comparing notes on Middle Eastern cuisine. The afternoon unfolded like a carefully orchestrated mission. Harold moved through the crowd, connecting people with shared experiences. A road warrior who had served as a combat medic found himself deep in conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez about modern medical techniques. Another biker discovered he had been stationed at the same base as Jim Parker's son. As the sun began to set, something remarkable happened. Big Mike asked for everyone's attention. Standing next to Harold, the biker leader looked almost uncomfortable, which was a new look for him. "Mr. Matthews," he began, his voice carrying across the now quiet yard, "we owe you an apology. We forgot something that was drilled into us in the service: respect. You've reminded us what brotherhood really means." He paused, looking at his fellow road warriors. "With your permission, we'd like to make this lot next door into something better than a hangout. Maybe a proper veterans gathering place, with your guidance." Harold looked at the faces around him, neighbors, veterans, bikers, all waiting for his response. The roses might have been crushed, but something new and perhaps more important had bloomed in their place. The week following the barbecue brought changes to Maple Street that no one could have predicted. Early Monday morning, Harold was surprised by the sound of motorcycles, but this time they came with a different purpose. Big Mike and 5 other road warriors pulled up to his house carrying gardening tools and new rose bushes. "These are the same kind Mrs. Matthews loved," Big Mike said, holding up a pink rose bush. "We asked at every garden center in town until we found them." Harold noticed the biker's hands were scratched from handling the thorny plants, but Big Mike didn't seem to mind. Together, they spent the morning replanting the garden, with Big Mike carefully following Harold's instructions about soil depth and spacing. As they worked, Harold learned that Big Mike had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine Corps sergeant. "Lost my best friend there," Big Mike shared while patting down soil around a rose bush. "Coming home was harder than being there. That's when I found the motorcycle club." They understood without asking questions. Other road warriors began showing up regularly, not to cause trouble but to learn from Harold. They discovered that the old veteran had a lifetime of stories and wisdom to share. His front porch became a gathering spot where young veterans could talk about their struggles with someone who truly understood. The empty lot underwent a remarkable transformation. The bikers, using their own money and labor, cleared the trash and brought in gravel. They set up proper benches and a small memorial flagpole. Harold helped them design the space, using his military experience in logistics to create an organized layout that would work for both quiet gatherings and larger meetings. Mrs. Chen's grandson Tommy, who had once been afraid of the bikers, now watched fascinated as they worked. One day, a road warrior named Jack, who had served as a combat engineer, showed Tommy how to build a small wooden bench. "My grandfather taught me woodworking when I came back from Iraq," Jack explained. "Sometimes working with your hands helps quiet the mind." The neighborhood's attitude shifted as understanding grew. Mrs. Rodriguez discovered that 3 of the road warriors worked as first responders, and they began coordinating their schedules to keep an eye on the street during night shifts. Mr. Thompson, who had once complained about the bikers, found himself sharing coffee with them, discussing his son who was currently serving in the Navy. Harold's influence extended beyond just bringing peace to the street. The road warriors started inviting him to their official club meetings, where his strategic thinking and experience helped them organize support for struggling veterans in the community. They valued his advice on everything from organizing charity rides to helping younger veterans find jobs. One particular Wednesday evening, Harold sat in his usual spot on the porch, watching as several road warriors taught local kids about motorcycle safety in the reformed lot. Big Mike walked up and sat beside him. "You know what's funny, sir?" Big Mike said, watching his fellow bikers interact with the neighborhood children. "We thought we were just finding a place to hang out. Instead, we found a purpose." Harold nodded, understanding exactly what Big Mike meant. "That's what I learned in the Navy," he replied. "Sometimes the best missions are the ones where you help others find their way home." The road warriors began incorporating military values into their club structure, inspired by Harold's example. They established a code of conduct that emphasized respect, community service, and veteran support. Their leather vests now carried a new patch, a small anchor symbol honoring Harold's naval service. As summer approached, the club organized its first community veterans support ride. Over 50 motorcycles gathered in front of Harold's house, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. Harold, wearing a leather vest they had given him, over his pressed cakus, of course, stood proudly as Big Mike announced the ride's purpose, raising funds for the local VA hospital's PTSD program. Before they departed, each rider stopped to salute Harold. The neighbors came out to watch, no longer seeing a gang of troublemakers, but a group of veterans helping other veterans. Mrs. Chen even brought out dumplings for the road. Standing on his porch, Harold felt Martha would have been proud. The roses were blooming again, and something else had bloomed too, a new kind of understanding that bridged generations of veterans. As the motorcycles roared away, their sound no longer seemed disturbing to anyone on Maple Street. Instead, it had become the sound of healing, purpose, and brotherhood. 1 year after the infamous Rose Garden incident, Maple Street had become a different place entirely. The empty lot, once an eyesore, had been transformed into Veterans Unity Park, complete with well-maintained benches, a memorial wall, and a garden that rivaled Harold's. The Road Warriors had installed a special plaque at the entrance that read, "Dedicated to Harold Matthews, USN, who taught us that understanding builds bridges." On this particular Sunday afternoon, Harold sat in his usual rocking chair, but he wasn't alone. His porch had been expanded, courtesy of the Road Warriors construction crew, to accommodate regular gatherings of veterans from all eras. Today, 6 leather-clad bikers and 3 older veterans sat with him, drinking lemonade and sharing stories. Big Mike, now a frequent visitor, had taken to calling these sessions Harold's Academy of Life. The neighborhood kids had an even better name for them: Story Time with Grandpa Harold and the Cool Bikers. Either way, these gatherings had become a cherished tradition on Maple Street. "Tell them about the typhoon again, Harold," Big Mike requested, adjusting his leather vest that now sported several community service patches alongside his Marine Corps insignia. The other bikers nodded eagerly, even though they'd heard the story before. Harold's way of connecting his naval experience to life lessons made each telling special. As Harold began his story, Mrs. Chen appeared with a fresh plate of dumplings. She no longer hurried back home but stayed to listen, sometimes adding her own family's stories of resilience during difficult times. Her grandson Tommy, now a regular at these gatherings, sat cross-legged on the porch steps, sketching pictures of motorcycles in a notebook given to him by Jack, the combat engineer. The Road Warriors had become more than just accepted in the neighborhood. They were now an integral part of its fabric. Every Thursday, they escorted Mrs. Rodriguez home from her night shift at the hospital. They helped Mr. Thompson teach his son basic motorcycle maintenance before he left for Navy boot camp. Their presence, once feared, had become a source of security and community pride. Harold's Rose Garden had flourished beyond its original glory. The Road Warriors had turned its maintenance into a group project, with different members taking turns helping the elderly veteran tend to the flowers. They even added a small memorial section for fallen veterans, where pink roses bloomed alongside white ones, symbolizing peace and remembrance. The empty lot next door had become a model for other communities. Veterans groups from neighboring towns visited to learn how a potential conflict had transformed into a story of understanding and cooperation. The Road Warriors, under Harold's guidance, had developed a program to help other motorcycle clubs connect with their local communities. "You know what the best part is?" Big Mike said, addressing the gathered group. "We thought we were just finding a place to park our bikes. Instead, we found a family." The other bikers nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the kind of peace that comes from belonging somewhere. Harold looked around at the scene before him, Tommy teaching younger kids about motorcycle safety under Jack's supervision, Mrs. Chen and several bikers planning next week's community dinner, various veterans from different eras sharing stories and support. It was more than he could have imagined when he first formulated his plan a year ago. The Road Warriors had even started a scholarship fund in Harold's name for veterans pursuing education. The Harold Matthews Bridge Builder Scholarship, they called it, helping former service members transition to civilian life through education and community support. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the expanded porch, Harold noticed something remarkable. The sound of motorcycle engines, which once brought tension to the neighborhood, now carried a different meaning. It had become the sound of friends arriving, of support rolling in, of a community coming together. Big Mike stood up, raising his lemonade glass. "To Harold Matthews, he announced, who taught us that the biggest battles are won not with fists or fury, but with understanding and respect. Everyone raised their glasses, and Harold felt Martha would have loved seeing this moment. Later that evening, as the last motorcycle rumbled away and the street quieted down, Harold sat alone on his porch. The roses swayed gently in the evening breeze, their sweet scent mixing with the lingering aroma of Mrs. Chen's dumplings. He smiled, thinking about how life's greatest victories sometimes come disguised as its biggest challenges. A young veteran had asked him earlier that day, "How did you know your plan would work?" Harold's answer was simple. "In the Navy, I learned that every storm eventually passes, but the bridges we build during peaceful times last forever."